Good morning and welcome to the Strategy and Policy Committee meeting for the 8th of August. We'll kick off with a Karakia. We might use... which one will I use? Me inoi tātou I te atua, tēnei au, tēnei mātou. O mema, kua poti te hapori o Whanganui. Arahina ia mātou. Ki te whakatau ngā whakataonga pai, mō te rohi, mō ngā tangata katoa. Kia piki ai te ora o te hapori, me ngā iwi katoa o Whanganui. Huomie, huie, taikie. Let us pray, dear God, here we are, here I am, your elected members of Whanganui. Guide us to make good decisions for the district, for all people, to uplift our community and all peoples of Whanganui. Bring forth unity. It is done. Amen. Thank you. Shall we Waiata?
Mai, kona piringa, hene ako, tamau poko, tupoho potiki e, ko te awa ko.
Goodbye. Morning, Ross. Oh, morning, Philippa. You won't need to table your apology for lateness. What apologies do we have? Diane? I don't think we have any. No apologies? Any declarations of interest in relation to items of business today? Nope. Confirmation of minutes of the meeting of the 27th of June. Would someone like to move that they be...
Can I ask a question? Or?
Do you have a clarification
Yes,
or a correction of the minutes?
Yes.
Fire away.
It says the apologies from Jenny Duncan, whereas on the next page she actually moved.
Oh, perhaps she was here then. Thanks, Peter. We'll strike that from the minutes.
But then I'm happy to move.
Right, thank you. Do I have a second to thank you, Glenda? Any debate? All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. Thank you. Just noting Jenny's leave of absence. So just in terms of late items, we have one late item, and that was the paper relating to the review of the local the LAP. That you've all had a copy of that in time to read it. Thank you. So we're going to accept that as a late item. So I'll move the recommendation that what are we receiving it?
Yeah.
Receiving it as a late item.
The words up there.
Yep. Thank you. That the council considers the following late item. Well, it's the committee actually considers the following late item: annual review of the off-licence cap under the local alcohol policy, noting that this item was not on the agenda because it was not finalised at the time the agenda was published, and that the report cannot wait until a subsequent meeting because the matter is time sensitive. So that is the recommendation that I'm putting. Do I have a seconder? Thank you, Ross. Any discussion? All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. Thank you. We also have additional information. There's 2 items of additional information. The first is a letter that we've just received formalising the request from the District Licensing Committee that we review the LAP. And the second one is an update to the work program. Just a few ticks in a few of the wrong places. So that is the other late item. Have we passed that around the table, Diane, or not? The second item?
I believe that Elise Broadbent passed it around the table, the DLC late item.
Oh, well.
Shall I make copies?
No, I think Hannah was looking after that. So have we got copies of the DLC letter to hand around and the work program update? We'll have to run off copies of it. Okay. Cool. So I'm moving that they be tabled as late items. Do I have a seconder? Thank you, Josh. Any debate? All those in favour, please say aye.
Madam Chair,
Yes.
clarification, do we not need to see it before we can vote on it?
We're just tabling it. You'll get it any minute now.
So we're happy to, okay, cool.
Yep, thank you. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. Thank you. So, I'm suggesting that we renumber our items this morning and instead make our first report to the committee the late item, which is the annual review of the off-licence cap under the local alcohol policy. And then we'll just take the committee work program next, the government consultation update, and then the final report will be the progress report against the Vision for Whanganui work program. Are we all good with that? Thank you. All right, so item what is now 5.1, the annual review of the off-licence. Thank you, Hannah and Elise.
Thank you. Apologies, I've been unwell, so I'm going to stay masked, and I will do my best to speak clearly into the microphone. Feel free to let me know if I'm trailing off or you can't hear what I'm saying.
Sure, thanks, Hannah.
So, as discussed, this is the review of the off-licence cap under the local alcohol policy. I just want to lead off by referring to the late material, which is the request from the District Licensing Committee for a review of the policy. We only received that this morning, so we have not had the opportunity to incorporate it into the report itself, but we have read it, and our recommendations in the report are the same as they were before. We would have made more references to it if we'd had it sooner, but our recommendations are not changed on the basis of that request. So there are 2 key questions in front of the committee. The first is based on the cap review. So the question is the cap contrary to development objectives and potential in the Whanganui district? This is the first thing we need to decide. And the second question is, should we undertake a review of the policy? So the first question is the yearly review that we're required to bring back of the cap. Our review basically is development objectives and potential are the key terms that we need to decide whether or not the cap is operating alongside. There's no kind of further definition or explanation of how we're supposed to interpret that, so we've gone to outside material like the economic development strategy. It seems likely that this is probably economic and is based on the ideal of growth, but not growth at any cost. So we should be promoting growth and development within the district, but we shouldn't be doing it at the expense of everything else, which also lines up with the Sale and Supply of Alcohol Act, balancing economic growth with minimising alcohol-related harm. In practice, what the cap is doing is requiring every application for an off license to go to hearings rather than being decided on papers. So, based on the cap, the tri-agencies oppose any application for an off license. In ordinary circumstances, these applications could be decided on papers rather than going to a full hearing, but because of the cap, the tri-agencies are objecting to new off licenses, and because of those objections, the applications then go to hearings. However, licenses are still being granted within the district. There have been 3 in the last 4 years that have been brought for off-license hearings. Those licenses have been granted. So our review of the cap, in short, is that while it's not likely that boutique distilleries were considered as part of the development of the cap, it is not currently contrary to development objectives and potential, because these industries are still developing in the Whanganui district. If there were, if the wording of the Act was different, or if off licenses had been declined on the basis of the cap, this would be a very different conversation. But our, the officer level review of the cap is that it is not contrary to development objectives and potential in the Whanganui district. The second question, should we review the policy? So this can be related to the first question or not. If the committee finds that the cap is contrary to development objectives and potential, it is then open to decide that we should review the LAP on that basis, or any other basis, essentially. Our recommendation is that it is not worth reviewing the LAP at this time, because, again, although there are ways in which it could be more clearly framed, there is a significant level of cost currently associated with undertaking a review of the local alcohol policy, with the possibility both of the amount of groundwork that needs to go into developing an updated policy and the potential for legal review, which can go all the way up to the Supreme Court. So there is the consideration of cost, there is the consideration of risk, where local authorities who have developed LAPs have in the past stopped partway through because of cost and time constraints and that kind of thing. And the LAP provides benefits besides the cap. So if we were to undertake a review, it could, in the end, become more economical to abandon the policy review rather than keep going with it, and we would lose the additional benefits that we have from the policy as it stands. And lastly is the legal review. So the Sale and Supply of Alcohol Act is currently going through several modifications, but the one we're interested in is the Community Participation Amendment Bill, which stands to significantly reduce the amount of cost required to go through a policy review. So we are currently recommending that, although we do need to get started with the policy review sometime before the middle of next year, we need to know what the end status of that Community Participation Amendment Bill is, ideally, before we do that. So we are currently not recommending a policy review at this time, but we are recommending that a policy review should be undertaken by June of 2024 at the latest, because if there's been no progress on the bill by that point, we'll have reached the stage where we need to start work on a policy review, because otherwise we won't have time to finish it before the statutory deadline. Do you have anything to add? Yep.
Thank you,
Could
Hannah.
I ask for, could we have a few minutes to read
Yes,
this?
we will
It's really
after.
hard to consider
Yes.
that here. It can be quite.
Pa?
Yep.
Once we've finished questioning, not
It's hard.
completely closed questioning, I'll allow a few minutes to read the letter.
Yeah. I personally prefer to do it
Yeah,
before
no,
questions,
you've got
so
a
we get the
yes.
full context.
I'll allow further time for questions after. But let's deal with the, Elise, when you've finished, we'll
Yeah, I thought
deal
I'd
with
just,
the top of
thank you,
mind
Hannah.
questions.
And yeah, apologies for the lateness. We also received it this morning. So I just wanted to add a few more points. I think Hannah covered this off well, but just for clarification, the cap, when put in place in 2019, was 14 off licences. As Hannah mentioned, there have been 3 granted over the cap since the policy has been put in place, and so there's now 17 off licences. And the reason for this is because the Independent District Licensing Committee is only required to have regard to the policy, not give effect to it. And as Hannah mentioned, when the policy was put through, it went through a number of reviews and appeals, which resulted in a clause being put in around requiring council do the annual cap review. So there's really these 2 parts, the cap and the local alcohol policy review overall. So we really want to try and treat them quite separately. So as mentioned, although the cap does apply to a whole range, it applies to all off licences, we believe boutique distilleries and craft breweries, for example, were not considered when the LAP was put in place. But the fact, as Hannah's mentioned, the fact that these businesses have continued to open and continued to receive licences is, in our view, not creating a impediment to development. We believe the cap is simply providing a safeguard, which in practical terms requires new off-licence applicants to go to hearings. So we think this is a reasonable balance of interests between new business development and preventing alcohol harm. So we believe the cap is providing a reasonable limitation. It's not preventing people from getting licences, but it's providing a safeguard. And that also feeds into our conclusion that the cap is therefore not inconsistent with development objectives in the district and does not need to be amended at this time. The important thing to keep in mind is the committee or the council cannot change the cap in isolation. If there is a desire to amend the cap in any way, it will trigger a full policy review. That's the critical point. We cannot simply tinker with the cap and say, oh, let's up the cap or down the cap. That will trigger a full review. So if the committee wishes to change the cap, they need to keep in mind it will lead to that full policy review. And for all of the reasons that Hannah has stated, we do not believe now is the right time to do a full policy review. Because of the Sale and Supply of Alcohol Act, the overarching legislation is currently under review by central government. There are bills going through Parliament right now. Until we know how those are going to land, it wouldn't be sensible to initiate a review right now. And also, as Hannah's outlined, that would come at some risk and some cost to us, as well as other competing work priorities, which is why we're suggesting that a full review would be better by June 2024. And other than that, I think we're happy to leave the papers read, happy to take questions, or if you need time to...
Yeah, we will take a bit of time, but I've got a couple of questions straight off. The first is, in terms of a hearing, you know, these boutique breweries having to come to a hearing, what's involved in that?
So the process around a hearing, essentially, it's got a higher evidential threshold, and they have to appear in person and answer questions from the committee and present further evidence. So it basically requires more groundwork on their part. I've attempted to get an estimate of sort of the cost involved in the general cost involved in going to hearing, but I haven't been successful in finding out what that is. But yeah, so it requires being more prepared because it's presenting to a hearing in person like this and being asked questions alongside the tri-agencies, as opposed to sending in your information on paper and having the decision issued based on that.
Thank you. My next question is, what is the status of a LAP when you go through a review process?
Yeah, so there are a few kind of stages in the review process of a LAP specifically. So our LAP would remain in place theoretically until we finalise the new one. The process is you have to create a draft lap, which is, it's kind of the draft version of what you're about to put in place. You then go through the consultation period, and once that's done, you then have a provisional lap, which can then be subject to appeal, which goes to ALA and can be appealed from ALA to, I believe, the High Courts and then the Court of Appeal and the Supreme Court. Once all of that has been resolved, you have a finalised new lap, essentially, as the new one takes over.
So which lap is in place while you're going through all of that process? Is it still the old lap?
It would be the existing one.
Right.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. Couple more questions before we just take a few minutes. Ross and Rob.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Rob?
Thank you. Hannah, the dairies and groceries and supermarkets are not covered by our lap. So can you just tell me, what process does a dairy have to go through to be able to sell alcohol?
Yeah, so they still need to get a license. It can be decided on the papers, so they would sort of collect the information that they have, that they're doing it safely, they're complying with the law, they're not providing it to people who are underage or irresponsibly, and send that into the district licensing committee, who would review that evidence and then make a decision based on the paper that's been sent in.
So what about a dairy, for instance, that's opposite a school? Would that come under the same? Could the licensing committee turn down that?
They can do. So one of the more general provisions under the LAP is, I believe, the district licensing committee needs to consider the proximity to sites of interest like schools. So the district licensing committee would be required to take that into consideration when deciding whether or not to give a license.
Okay. Yes, I've always felt that this whole
Questions,
process is a
Rob?
farce. But the other question is the review process. What can you just detail what a review process is? How long it takes, and
You can take that.
So, in terms of the last review, I think, yeah, it was about two years, 18 to 24 months. It would be your standard approach of doing research, pulling together the draft policy, consulting with the community on it, obviously talking to key stakeholders and interest groups, engaging with key partners, iwi partners, Safer Whanganui and the police, the tri-agencies, which is police, health and the licensing inspector. So what happened with the last one, I wasn't here, but I believe it was started prior to 2017. There was a provisional lap put in place, and then that provisional lap was appealed, and through the appeal process it was only finalised in 2019. So that, that's a considerable length of time. Through the legislation that is currently going through the House, it would remove the right to appeal a provisional lap. So it may cut down some of the cost and the time involved for councils. Yeah, I'll just refer you to paras 30 onwards in the report. It outlines what other councils have been through in New Zealand. And you'll see Christchurch City Council began consulting on their draft lap in 2013, but discontinued it after spending $1 million. And Auckland Council developed theirs in 2015, and it's gone all the way to the Supreme Court. So, there is significant risk in reviewing the lap, in that we may potentially, under the current framework, lose the other benefits that it affords us. So the cap is not the only thing that it regulates. It regulates opening hours and other safety provisions. So there is that risk that exists regardless. And that's why we really do want to wait for the legislative framework to be clear.
So another thing to bear in mind is that ours took 2 years. We did not go through the full set of appeals. We were also negotiating while we were being appealed, and eventually came up with the lap as it currently stands, which was acceptable to the parties who were appealing us to get them to withdraw their appeals. Auckland District Council, as Elise mentioned, has still not finalised theirs. They recently succeeded in the Supreme Court, the decision of which referred the whole case back to ALA to make a decision. So they're still going, last I heard.
All right, thank you. Josh, Andrew, Charlotte, and Philippa.
Cool, thank you. I just want to make sure that I've got this 100% correct. So, under the current policy, the only additional, I guess, pressure that an applicant who falls outside of the cap has is that they have to appear before a hearing, but there's no actual cost associated with that hearing. They don't have to pay an additional fee of any sort, do they?
Do you know about the hearing itself? I don't think so, do they?
Sorry, we don't know the answer to whether or not they...
There would be some amount of additional cost in preparing their material. I'm not sure whether they actually have to pay for the hearing itself.
It'd be good to have clarity on that. It's not a massive issue, but I think it's important that we understand that. My only other question is around the bill going through Parliament at the moment. Is that a private member's bill or a government bill?
Government bill.
Government bill. Okay, thank you.
Andrew?
Yeah, look, I just thought it might be worth clarifying the origin of this letter that you've got that's been tabled in front of everyone. Is that okay?
If you wouldn't mind, we'll just take the rest of the questions and then you can do that clarification before we take a few minutes to read it. Charlotte, then Philippa.
Thank you. So what sparks the appeal and as far as the Supreme Court? Is that because of pressure from big players?
Yes. Go on.
Essentially, yes. So I guess it depends on how you mean the question. So the appeal comes about, as far to my knowledge, this is the only section of policy where this happens in local authority. But anyone who has submitted to the consultation on a draft lap can then appeal in the provisional lap stage. So theoretically, it can be done by any member of the community who submitted during the consultation. I think this has happened, but the ones that take it through are all the way to the Supreme Court are
The ones with the money,
industry.
Right? Yeah. Thank you.
Philippa, questions?
Thank you. Couple of questions. There's no comment in here on the online sales. And
In the paper, Philippa.
in the paper, I don't believe, which I guess my
There
question
is.
is there. Can you,
Yes. Do you want to?
can we get? Can you,
How about you pause that question while you reread your paper, and we
Can
read
they
this
point me
letter.
to the
Did you have
place?
another question?
Well, a little bit. Why haven't we got the actual lap in the papers? Because I believe we should have. And in regard to the cost of a hearing, there certainly is cost. Obviously, in answering that question, the district licensing committee, the whole activity falls within. It falls within the activity of alcohol, but the district licensing committee. Well, I'm trying to answer something because no one else seems to be able to answer it. The district licensing committee members are all paid for a hearing. Those fees are over $400 for a half day, I believe. I would be very surprised if there's not costs to the applicants as well, but it all falls within that. But obviously, those are answers we need to have, because I guess when we're considering, we need to understand the cost of a hearing, as opposed to if we make any, as opposed to, because if we.
So, Philippa, what I'm hearing is that you're speculating on whether what the size of the cost is, and I think I agree. Ideally, we would have that information. Did you have another question?
Not at this stage.
Well, we can pick up more
It's an-
later.
yeah.
I suggest we just we'll go to Andrew if you want to give us the backdrop to
Yep.
how this letter has arrived, and then we'll take a few minutes, pause the meeting, and then come back to the meeting and take further questions.
Sure, great, okay. So look, this is obviously, thank you first of all, Chair, for allowing us to table this. A request was sent to me at the start of this year to review the local alcohol policy. Unfortunately, the attachment was different from this one here, so it was sent in error. I followed up on the attachment and closed that off specifically, and then it came to Stuart Hilton's attention yesterday that actually why hasn't this been done? And it hadn't been done because the wrong attachment got sent. So it was all done in error and good intention, so that's why this has now only been received today. And I suddenly realised, hang on, I must have got the wrong attachment, and Stuart Hilton has realised that as well after I alerted him. So that's why that's here. In saying that, I think Hannah's given the advice that given there's a legislative review, that perhaps we should wait for that to happen, that review to happen first before we do our own review anyway. But anyway, here it is for your information.
Thank you. So, did you want to say something, Elise, just before we take a few minutes to read this letter properly?
Yeah, we just have an email confirming that there's no cost related to any DLC matter. There is a cost to the applicant, not inspector, where the matters proceed to ALA, which is the authority that oversees the Act. So once it goes up to appeal, that's through from Steve. And I'll just draw your attention to the sections on online remote sales. It is a very important point, I think, that's being raised about how the context has changed nationally and in Whanganui. So we talk about it at paras 36 and 37. And then in terms of the scope of the current policy, we also talk about how online remote sales have changed. Now, this is an area that would require central government intervention because at the moment, a local alcohol policy has no ability to manage online sales because what people are doing is registering in a different district and then selling online. So the alcohol can be brought in Whanganui, but it is licensed elsewhere. So our cap will be possibly preventing some businesses wanting to do and register their online sales here, but because there are not local alcohol policies in all councils and because of the way the legislation works, these caps and these local alcohol policies are not preventing the proliferation of online sales. And we don't believe this is something the legislation will address? No, so it's not being addressed at the national level either.
Thank you. Can you just repeat for me the information about the cost? So there is no cost to coming to making an application and the hearing in itself, but there is a cost at which stage?
So there's essentially two areas of cost. There is no cost. You don't have to pay the DLC to have a hearing with them. You will need to pay some additional cost because going to a hearing requires more preparation. So that's more time, more effort spent in getting ready for a hearing. So there is an increased cost according to that. And if a matter gets appealed to ALA, you then have to, or beyond that, you as an applicant have to pay a fee. But that's not something that somebody who's looking for an off license would do.
No. Okay.
So that's more on the if our policy gets appealed to ALA and then to the High Court, the Court of Appeal, the Supreme Court, the applicant has to pay a fee. So those are the two fees.
Right. Thank you very much for getting us that information so quickly. We'll take a few minutes to read this letter and then All right. Further questions? Thank you. Are there further questions? I'll have a question. Steve, would you mind coming up to the table? I'd just like to clarify what's involved in these hearings. My interpretation of what we're being told is that a paper-based application for an off-licence versus a hearing is actually having to go through the process of thinking about, so how is this going to work actually in my outlet? How is this going to work, and what safeties or processes are we going to put in place in practical terms to make sure we do what we should be doing in terms of drunken patrons or whatever.
Yes,
Can you kind of flesh that out a bit for me?
so all premises looking for an off-licence application, all premises applications, regardless of off or on, need to provide a host responsibility policy. That policy needs to look at all sorts of nuisance conditions, intoxication, of course, harm, transport issues, so taxi availability, noise, so the usual kind of social, antisocial stuff needs to be considered in that. So every application, off, on, club, so a premises style licence, needs to consider those and have that formally presented to the DLC in the application process. It's fleshed out. Some of them are larger, some of them are smaller. Again, it's risk-based, but it's a requirement.
And would you describe it as an onerous requirement?
No, I don't think. And the reason I say no is it's a templated type of response. There is a template available for applicants. It's not too onerous, but detail is important. So some areas like noise, we need to look at specific levels. So that can be a little bit specific, if you like.
To location and things like
But
that.
not difficult to find. And there's help available within the health team to sort of flesh that out for them. But yeah, there's going to be some standards that need to be quantifiable, measurable.
Okay, thank you. Glenda, did you have a question?
Yes, thank you. Hannah, you made a comment when you were giving your presentation that it could be more clearly framed. Could you just explain that a little bit more to me, please?
So there is some validity to the point that there is no distinguishing in the policy between boutique distilleries and bottle stores.
Yep.
If we lived in an ideal world, we would be able to make that distinction more clearly. It's not ideal that it's a blunt instrument, essentially. It is 14 off licenses. If it's an off license, it technically falls under the cap. So yeah, there are some areas in which some better clarity would be desirable, but our ultimate view is that looking at the evidence, it's not creating a barrier to these businesses opening, so it's not contrary to development objectives and potential. It's creating a threshold, a compliance threshold that they have to pass, but it's not blocking them.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Glenda. Helen?
Thank you. So I guess my main concern is around the cost and delay for the applicants. And I'm not hearing that it's too onerous, but we haven't heard directly from any of them, what their personal experience is. It could be quite different, if you're not used to filling out the forms, I suppose. So does anybody have any direct feedback from those applicants to any of this process? So like the Papaiti gins, for example, have we actually canvassed them?
No, so this is, we've been in touch with Whanganui and Partners as part of this CAP review. As part of that conversation, I inquired sort of just to get a general idea of what the costs and delays would be involved in going to hearing, and I didn't get an answer to that, so. I don't know if there is sort of an average, but we can potentially conclude from the fact that licenses haven't been declined. The people who have applied for licenses have gotten them broadly. If there were a high number of people applying and being declined, that would tend to suggest that this process is creating more of an obstacle to them. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I guess it's. I mean, I think many of us
Is
have.
this a question? Or is it commentary?
Who was that? Well, no. I mean, I can't make it a question except to say that.
I think Steve's got something to offer.
Is there any opportunity for us to hear directly from applicants who've gone through this process? Because at the moment, that was
All right,
that's my
we'll
question.
just park that.
Yeah.
I can make some comment about the application process for off licenses specifically. There's no difference in costs, so the application fee is the same from beginning to end, at least through the DLC process. The process starts with the applicants usually having some form of consultation with the inspectors. At the very beginning, all off applicants are aware that this process includes going to the DLC to a hearing. So they're fully aware that it includes that consideration. I've not had one yet not go through that process.
Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Your question's noted, Helen, but we don't have do we have an answer?
So what we're looking at for the CAP review is a technical review of the policy as it operates. We've been as broad canvassing as we think is appropriate in putting this together. If we were to go out and speak to the general, well, not necessarily the general public, but external people who are involved in this, that would bring it more into the realm of sort of the policy review that is the second question. That would be more appropriate to be considered as part of the policy review than as part of the CAP review.
Yes, to add to that, our view is it would not be appropriate at this stage to be having those conversations directly. We believe at the CAP review phase, based on it's an officer reviewed level, technical review. We would note that this review has gone significantly further than previous reviews have gone, where we have gone out to speak to Whanganui and partners, and we've gone further to look at the development potential and understand that. We don't think it's appropriate at this stage to speak to those applicants.
It would have to be done as a part of a
formal review
rather than an officer review. All right. Philippa, questions?
Yeah. I mean, so how do you respond to the District Licensing Committee letter, well, from the chair, or the inspector, sorry, District Licensing, what's his position anyway, Stuart Hilton.
He's a chairman, isn't he?
He's the chairman, yeah. No, he's actually the District Licensing Commissioner. That's what he is.
Is he? Thank you.
Yeah, he's a commissioner.
Steve's nodding.
Yeah. Well, it's around how do officers respond to the letter that has strongly suggesting the costly repeat hearings are a real issue, not just so costly repeat hearings. We've just heard there's no cost. Of course, I said there is a cost because, of course, the hearing committee all get paid significant fees, but also the time wastage, I would call it, of key agencies that police, the medical officer of health, all have to, basically this letter, how do we respond to them, or how do officers respond to them suggesting that asking for an urgent review because of the cost implications, because of the fact that the agencies are having to oppose the cap because it falls, that's the issue, it falls outside of the cap. And they really are, they feel they have to, the words I think there, but they have to oppose it. What's officers' response to that?
I think, as I mentioned at the top, we only received that request this morning, so we haven't had time to go over it, and I'm not sure it would be entirely appropriate for us to have a response, if that makes sense. It's not
Look,
our
I'm
position
going to push back a bit on that, Hannah, because in the conversations of, like at the chair's briefing, I understood that it was very clear to us that we needed to do this review, and that informally the District Licensing Committee had requested that we do so. So frankly, I'm not seeing a lot of new information here other than what I've already informally heard. So I'm going to ask you the question again. What is our response in terms of why we think that at this point, notwithstanding what is in that letter, what is our response to that? Why do we not think that a full review is appropriate at this time?
Because the extent of cost involved in a policy review still significantly outweighs what's gone into hearings. To be blunt, what's said in the request for a review about conducting hearings, there have been 3 hearings in the past 4 years. As we've acknowledged that there is an extra cost to people going for a license and going to hearing rather than being decided on the papers. You do not have to pay the District Licensing Committee a fee. You do have to put in more time and more money in getting your resources together for a hearing. The ratepayer pays the cost for the District Licensing Committee hearing. That is still significantly lower than what we would be looking at if we had to take our local alcohol policy to the Supreme Court. So the costs, there are costs involved in it, as we've acknowledged, but the costs involved in going to hearings, as they stand, are still significantly below the costs that would be involved in a policy review if we're looking at the risk of hearing. So our recommendation remains the same. It would be best not to go through a policy review until we know the state of the Act and how likely we are to be to face an appeal to ALA and beyond.
Good. Thank you.
Elise.
Elise, did you want
Yes,
to add to that?
I'll reiterate that the overarching legislation is currently unclear. It would not be an appropriate time to launch a full policy review. This is why we haven't gone out and talked to all our applicants, and we haven't spent time, because we're currently in a situation where we are trying to be as efficient as possible and as sensible as possible with council money. We're not going out and doing a lot of research and extra additional work at this time. It's not the right time to review the policy in our view. However, we will start the review as soon as that legislation is clear. So it may start this year, and it will start no later than June next year. So my response to the District Licensing Committee is, we hear you. The policy is not perfect. We acknowledge that. We acknowledge that in the paper, that when the policy was put in place, it didn't take into account boutique distilleries and craft breweries. We acknowledge it creates a barrier, but now is not the time to review the policy. And unfortunately, we can't just tinker with the cap. We can't just change the cap. It would trigger the full policy review. So we can commit to start that review as early as we have clarity on the legislation. But it would be, as Hannah says, it would be a big cost to council to do it now. And we have other competing priorities we have to consider as well.
Thank you. Questions? I'm starting to think we should be wrapping this up. We've given it a good thrashing. But Philippa, you have another question?
I guess it's just, no, thank you for that response. And I mean, and yeah. But in light of this, with this letter, the last, I guess my question is perhaps to you, Chair, and is in regard to whether we could delay this decision or make if it was the opportunity to meet with the District Licensing Committee as they've said they are available, just to give them a voice, a further voice of their concerns and have a discussion prior to us making a decision, that would seem, without onerous delay, what's the risk of delaying, perhaps making an interim type of decision, but giving the opportunity. I just feel like, I don't quite understand why this letter was delayed or why we've got it now, but then it would give us a more complete picture, I think, to make our decision.
Yeah, but would it change the decision, Philippa? Really? I mean, yeah.
It's just they're
so the question is, sorry? Thank you. We've got a few more questions, but I'm very grateful to you. Thank you. Just, the question is, would there be anything that would preclude us from delaying this decision?
I might ask Steve or Justin to talk to this. I think there's some, if you think about the balance of powers, I think there's a distinction here to make, is that the District Licensing Committee is like a court, and that they take the policy, interpret it and apply it, and they are independent from council. While they are paid, acknowledge that, and we do acknowledge that in the paper, that they are independent but paid by council. I acknowledge that, but I just want to, do you want to talk to this, Steve? Or? Yeah, we need to be careful about the separation here.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure if that would be appropriate.
Okay, I'll take that. That's a good answer. Thank you. That'll do fine. Peter.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Just a quick question. It's a yes or no answer. And is that, are we preparing any submissions to the Act?
We submitted on the Community Participation Amendment Bill.
You have.
So we have done. That has been through submissions, and we did submit on it.
Cool. Yeah. Thank you.
That was quite a long yes. Ross.
Oh, thank you. One question. And I do get your rationale, and especially your last couple of comments is very clear to me. My question is, are there aspects in the proposed legislation that you have identified that are of specific interest, so that when that legislation goes through, this will be of importance to the review of the local area policy?
Yes. So the reason why we're focusing on the Community Participation Amendment Bill specifically is one of the proposed changes in the base bill, and that was recommended by the Justice Select Committee, is to remove the ability for appeals. So people who have submitted during a consultation will no longer have the ability to appeal to ALA and beyond. They can get judicial review, which is standard for any policy in local government, but they will not be able to, they will not have a right to an appeal of our policy, which significantly changes the landscape from our perspective.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Josh.
Thank you. Also a question on the bill before Parliament. Assuming that the current government gets re-elected and the bill is still government policy, are you confident that it would be passed by June 24?
It's difficult to say. They've been, as my understanding is, it's been considered under urgency for its second reading, which was interrupted. It's possible. I think, unfortunately, we're in this position where, as local governments, we have statutory deadlines. At a certain point, we have to do it anyway.
Yeah.
So this is why we've highlighted June 2024 as this is the backstop date.
Mm-hmm.
It needs to be done by June 2025.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever the state of the legislation is, we need to get started. Ideally, even if it wasn't, if the current government remained in power, but the act was not passed, or the bill was not passed by June, we would have a further extension because we would be working on our draft for a while, essentially. So there would be more time beyond that before it became a problem, or potentially became a problem. So we're recommending June 2024 because this is where we need to start, really.
So ideally we'd have clarity on where the bill is at and whether it's been enacted or not. But if it's not, it doesn't preclude us proceeding as planned by June 24. Perfect.
Thank you.
Yeah, exactly. We have committed to proceed to meet the legislative timeframe regardless.
So we have to. Cool. All right, thank you. I have a recommendation moved and seconded by Rob and Michael, and that recommendation, those recommendations are that the Strategy and Policy Committee accepts the annual review of the off-licence cap under the local alcohol policy and requests the Chief Executive initiate a review of the local alcohol policy starting no later than June 2024. That is the recommendation that you want to put, gentlemen? That's a yes? Yep. Thank you. Right, debate. Peter.
Yeah, thank you for letting me go first for a change. I will fully support the recommendations. I think they're logical and are and confident the collective intelligence of the officers and their knowledge of the outweigh my own. So, like I say, I will be supporting the recommendation.
Thank you, Peter. Ross?
Just a question to the chair.
We're in debate.
If we wanted to hear from Stuart, and if we pass this, we
no, I'm sorry.
we're in debate.
Ross.
Sorry.
Thank you. Rob?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, I certainly will be supporting this, both the parts of this resolution. It just seems a simple, pragmatic solution to the situation at the moment, and it would be totally inappropriate to carry out a review while there's still legislation unfinished in Parliament. So it certainly has my support. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. Linda?
Thank you. Yes, I agree with my colleague with what you've just said about that. There is a, and I will be supporting this as well, and I look forward to the work that goes into the new policy to make it really clear and to give appropriate support to the licensing committee, because I feel like that they have got structure there, but they're feeling that it's not enough for them to make the decisions, obviously, that they would like to make. So I am supporting this, and I'm hoping that the licensing committee feels that they have enough support from us to make any decisions that they might need to make between now and June 2024. So thank you. I really look forward to reviewing the policy in the near future.
Thank you, Linda. Helen?
Philippa was next. First you went.
Philippa?
Yeah, thank you. I'll also be supporting these recommendations. I think we're in a no-win situation. Our LAP, while, I think this council did well to actually get a LAP in place, a local alcohol policy in place, as we can tell by how few there are in place. We did it for under, about circa $40,000. Cost too much, but nowhere near the councils like Christchurch and Auckland and some of those councils that basically had to give up. It has some reasonable limitations, but there's a degree where it becomes toothless as well. But I purely that is not on our district licensing committee. They have, I appreciate their letter. It's a shame this all came a little bit late, but it's better to get it now than not. They're stuck between a rock and a hard ball, in that. And I guess if I'd like, something to go forward is that in the current environment, why we're not going through a full policy review, that we appreciate the difficulty they're in, and I guess some of these what would be seen as low-level harm boutique businesses, etc. But also to our reporting agencies. The police and the medical officers of health, they've got a whole lot more important work to be doing than opposing caps on low-level harm, rather than being out there and dealing with the huge harm. I mean, this all really falls on the government. You know, the government needs to set some law across the country instead of chucking more money and making us go through our own policies. I mean, how many, you know, we've just read, you know, really sad to read, I'm sure we all are, that meth in our wastewater is the highest Whanganui in the country. Vaping, you know, look at the vaping laws, new laws, but it's not dealing with grocery stores around schools, etc. Just like just like our local alcohol policy is. So, the sooner the government and my reading of the legislation that's going through is not even dealing with one of the huge issues around being able to purchase, businesses being able to basically get a licence out of our district, in a district that doesn't have a local alcohol policy, and sell online. So, yeah, the government needs to step forward. Whichever government's re-elected needs to really deal with some of these huge scourges on our community and New Zealand. But at the moment, I think this is the best we can do.
Helen.
Yeah, thank you very much. Very good paper by staff and very good answers. Thank you very much. Look, we've had some really great innovative businesses set up, and I want to congratulate them. And there is, I believe, significant help through Whanganui and Partners for any other businesses contemplating establishing, and whilst there is an inconvenience factor and a cost to and time to go through their current procedure, I am well satisfied that this is the most practical solution at this time. So thank you to staff.
Does anybody else want to speak? Thank you. I think it was well phrased. The word of the day has to be pragmatic. This is a pragmatic response to what is not ideal. But I just want us to, I guess I'll give my comments over to paragraph 90, where officers have discussed the annual cap with iwi partners, and the initial response has been strong support for the cap to remain in place, and concerns that it is appropriate to limit wholesale alcohol sales, especially further bottle stores in the district. And while this piece of policy is not perfect, I believe that it is limiting further. I agree, it's limiting further wholesale bottle stores, the likes of the Black Bowl in this district. So, in terms of new businesses off licences having to come to a hearing, I believe it's not onerous. I believe it's entirely appropriate, because we need to remember that alcohol does create harm in our community, and if you have to rock up on a day and explain how your policies are going to work, well, I think that's all very good. And as we've seen and heard, that it's not a barrier to those businesses opening up. In fact, I think it probably improves their businesses. I'm sure it does, certainly for the community. So without further ado, we'll put the recommendations as I've read out. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. Thank you. Next item, we are moving to our work programme. Are there any... Oh, Lance, you're going to speak to this. Was there an update on what we've got in our papers?
Kia ora, everyone. I haven't received that, Kate, so I can't comment. And Anna's not here, so she's away sick today.
Okay.
So I'm working off what's on your papers.
All right. So, any questions about the work programme? Lance, is there anything that you wanted to particularly bring to our attention?
No, not really. Obviously, there's just a couple more meetings to go before the end of the year. There's a semantics point in there where it's called, in the summary, it calls it a draft. It's probably more accurate to call it a living document than a draft. So in September, you might expect to see a couple more ticks for October, for example. But that would be my only point. I get, sorry, one more point. There's a couple of empty boxes towards the bottom, infrastructure and property. And just in case you're wondering, I mean, the operations and performance work program will have more from those departments as such, and that would be what you would expect to see. So you're probably going to see less of them in the strategy part, if you like. So, but we will keep them on the program as much reminders for us as it is for yourselves.
Thank you. I've got a question just about the solid waste bylaw to support curbside services. Can you talk to us a little bit further about that?
Do you want the short answer? Are you wanting confirmation of which meeting it's going to be at?
Just what it looks like, really. What I'm a little bit lost to understand what we need there.
So you'll remember through the waste minimisation plan that was signed out, it was agreed through that plan to put in place a bylaw that would support the curbside services. That bylaw would have the ability to do things around waste management, such as regulate bin sizes, for example, and provide framework and structure for the industry. So that work is in its very early stages. We've started some work, but it's still very new, and we're going to align it with when the curbside services come in. So I suspect that won't be news to Rob and others who are on the waste group, that was committed through the waste plan.
Sure, thank you. Makes perfect sense now.
Can I just add something, please?
Yes.
One of the key issues that's being addressed in the solid waste bylaw is unlicensed operators, and that is a problem in the community with illegal dumping. There are people in this community and all communities that are providing a service to households and illegally dumping waste, and this will put in place an enforcement regime against that.
Right, thanks for that. Andrew, did you have a question?
Yeah, it's more probably clarification to understand, really. Are these all annual reviews, or are they biannual at all? Is there anything we do over a 2-year phase, or do we do all of these every year?
We certainly don't do all of these annually.
Right.
That would be difficult.
Yeah, that's what I would assume that would be the case. So is there a biannual review with others that aren't on this list?
I can't think of anything which is required to be biannually reviewed. Obviously, we have our annual plan, long-term plan, that is annual. And we have our annual CAP review, which we've just brought to you. The only other thing that comes up regularly is bylaws are required to be reviewed every 5 years, unless you get them onto what's called a 10-year track, and then they're required to be reviewed every 10 years. Okay. And I can't speak to the work in Justin's area. Otherwise, in the policy area, it would be as the policy comes up for review. So, for example, with the local alcohol policy, it's coming up for review in 2025. So we'll start the work ahead of it to make sure it meets its time frame.
Okay, so outside of the annual plan and this is really a 3-year cycle review?
No, more than that. No, they're all staggered at different stages, okay, depending on when they were brought through. I will note the community views survey we do annually. We're required to do that for our KPIs, and we'll be bringing that up by October. Justin, anything in your area?
District plan is 10-year rolling review for our district plan.
All right.
Alrighty.
Okay, and my other question is, if it does reference somewhere in here around government legislation. So, if legislation was passed, was there, I guess that is a paper that's brought to council reflecting the changes in legislation as opposed to a review?
We do have the standard government consultations update paper, which I think is the next paper coming up, where we bring submissions to you, and we do tend to loop back on what's come out of select committee, but we don't do a regular report on legislation generally. That would
Not generally, more specifically that affects council outside of it. Well, there's obviously the Local Government Act, but there's other legislation that is passed that has a effect on council operations and decisions.
I believe we do that through the government submissions paper and through other mechanisms as well.
Yep. I'd assume, yeah, we do that, but when those submissions go through and legislation is passed, how do we capture that?
It's a fair point.
Complete the loop.
Yeah, I'm not sure that we always close the loop when the legislation is actually passed and goes through royal assent and becomes law. So if that's something you'd like to see at that stage of the process, we could perhaps add it to the government consultation update. David looks like he wants to say something.
Yeah. He does get a look on his face, doesn't he? Just before he reaches forward.
Through you, Madam Chair, maybe some detail at an operational level that may help. So in the background, we maintain a register of all of the acts that have relevance to council. So when new legislation does get passed, we update those. Depending on the materiality of the impact, the significance, we may then highlight some of those changes through the Risk and Assurance Committee so that you can have assurance that we are actually adapting to whatever the new legislative regime is and amending our operational practices so that we maintain compliance.
Great, that's good. Thank you for that.
So, well, just further from that, do you think it would be too onerous given that, like we've got a government consultation update, which is our next item, if we had a government consultation and legislation update that we just covered off, particularly the material things that we might not have submitted on, do you think? I mean, to have a kind of loosely working awareness of what legislation's around and if impacts on councils wouldn't be bad for a strategy committee to have.
Through you, Madam Chair, I've seen Elise nod ahead already. Happy to incorporate something in that. My only comment would be, I think our register has 150 acts currently listed that impact on council, so probably best to keep it by exception and have a materiality threshold in the reporting.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you.
Great. No, that's my point, is managing risk, really.
Well, yeah, and the response to that is that it's going to the Risk and Assurance Committee, but yeah, no, I agree. Be good to fly by this committee as well. No further questions? Then we'll put the recommendation that the Strategy and Policy Committee receive the report, Strategy and Policy Committee Work Programme 2023. Thank you very much, Lance and Elise. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Josh. Any discussion? All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. Thank you. Consultation update. We're on page 17. Back you come again. I hope you get the afternoon off after this, Elise.
I know, I didn't get much sleep, so apologies. I'm not always as clear as I could be.
You're doing very well.
Thanks. All right, so this is the report on consultations being undertaken by central government and other organisations which have the potential to impact on the council and the wider district. So for this item, there's been one submission that we have put forth since the last report, and that's the Water Services Entities Amendment Bill. And Catherine Stewart is here to help speak to this item.
Welcome, Catherine.
So I think we're well aware of the suite of changes that the current government is bringing through with regards to Three Waters in New Zealand. And this last bill amends the Water Services Entities Act, which created 4 entities. And so the bill proposes to disestablish the 4 water service entities and replace them with 10 water service entities. Public submissions were open for a very short time, from 23rd of June to 5th of July, We provided our written submission and had it in on Monday, the 3rd of July, and then the Mayor and Chief Executive David Langford spoke to the submission on Wednesday, the 5th of July. So it was a very short time frame for hearings, and we were pleased to get ours in time and get a speaking slot. The Select Committee also requested some follow-up information about the financial implications of the reforms, which we just provided in an email. And since then, the Select Committee has done its formal report back on the bill, with some changes being made and some clarifications. So I think at this point I might hand it over to Catherine, because it probably will get into the technical bit, and then I'm happy to take other questions about the paper. Thank you.
Thanks, Elise.
Thanks, Elise, and good morning, everybody. I've circulated a sort of summary of the report to you all as well, but just a kind of couple of key points. Firstly, 2 of our asks were picked up on in the Select Committee report back as recommended changes. One, the Minister would be required to engage with councils in mana whenua before setting an establishment date. And there's also a few changes in relation to the powers for shared services. There's essentially a limit put on how long the Minister has to exercise those powers. All of those changes and a few of the others that I'll speak about shortly, it's worth remembering, do still need to go through the second reading in Committee of the House phases, and I think there's perhaps a little bit more tweaking that will come through those debates. We've spoken at the time of developing our submission that the rest of our asks weren't technically in the gift of the committee, and so unsurprisingly those have sort of not been issues that the committee has picked up on, both in relation to our submission but also where other councils had similar asks. But we have been continuing those conversations on those issues at officer levels in the kind of appropriate forums. The other changes that the committee proposed, and there was more there than I perhaps expected, but were broadly in line with the principles of what we've been seeking the whole way through. So that point around greater engagement and voice for local councils, communities and mana whenua, taking care of our staff, and as much clarity as possible in relation to long-term planning. The other changes were all sort of quite aligned with those points. The big ticket items were that an establishment date would have to be set within 6 months of the bill gaining royal assent, and in practical terms, assuming that the government sticks to its timeline of passing all the legislation before the House rises, that would see a date confirmed through order of council by the end of February. They also clarified that the RRG must have at least 1 representative per council. And on kind of rereading those clauses, it was apparent that you could have not technically had a single person per council and still met the legislation. So that's a positive clarification. Likewise, clarification around development contributions policies. This was a reasonably technical officer concern across a number of places, but also Paituara. And they've clarified that the policy can now include CapEx for water infrastructure, even if it is not being provided within our own long-term plans years 1 and 2. So it sort of bridges that gap between what we will eventually end up with in our long-term plan around water infrastructure and what will be picked up in the entity's years 3 to 10 asset management plans. And in terms of the kind of technicality and the detail of all that, there are a large number of conversations that officers are having as part of the long-term plan process, and that we're also having with the NTU around that asset management plan development. So there's a lot of work that sits behind that helpful clarification. The eligibility of who can make community priority statements has been widened. And that explicitly is to allow for regional, national or international organisations that carry out activities in New Zealand and whose purpose is in regards to water to make a community priority statement to the entity in the future. Finally, they gave some further guidance around the criteria for merging water service entities in the future. And firstly, they've specified that they must have a common boundary. and that they increased the proposed threshold for a merger being agreed to from 50% to 75% of the RRG. That brings it back into line with the other decisions that an RRG takes, so brings consistency in. And they also set out some criteria of what a merger proposal must demonstrate to ensure that there's sort of good governance of the water service entities in the future. Those are the kind of big ticket items, I think, from an officer perspective. Very happy to take any other questions or provide any further information.
Lovely, thank you. Are there any questions? No questions? All right, then we're going to put the recommendation that the Strategy and Policy Committee receives the report, Government Consultation Update for August 2023. I'll move that. Josh will second it. Does anybody want to speak to that? I will speak to it. Thank you very much to the team in particular for the submission to the three waters, and I'd like to thank the Chief Executive and the Mayor for speaking to it. It's important when legislation is getting formed that you are intelligent about it, you're articulate, that you articulate it well, and our submissions have certainly done that, and thirdly that you front up and you tell the folks down there what we think. So thank you very much for doing that. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. Thank you. Here she comes again. I'm sure there's a song. Yeah, anyway. Welcome. Are we PowerPointing, are we? Welcome, Robin. So your opening statement's going to be to remind everybody what we're calling this and why we're calling this what we're calling it. Does that sound clear? It's been a long 2 hours.
Thank you, Chair. So Robin's here to give a progress update on the long-term plan and the Vision for Whanganui work program. So the Vision for Whanganui is what we're calling the Leading Edge Strategy Replacement. And this is a working title / placeholder. We just really wanted to be quite clear on the difference between our long-term plan and the strategy vision work, and we wanted a name that was perhaps, you know, would resonate a bit more with the community. So that's what we're working with, but we do want to reiterate that the name of the final strategy will be determined through the community consultation and engagement process. So that's not the final name. All right, so Robin will run us through a progress update.
Thank you, Elise, and kia ora koutou. So yeah, as you're obviously aware, we're in the midst of the long-term plan and Future for Whanganui process. I'll just Vision for Whanganui, yeah. So as a reminder, these are all the key streams of work that are currently happening throughout that process. So we've got 11 streams that are happening. So the purpose of this is to provide you that kind of top level update. We're not going to get into any of the operational details today. But because some of those, because we're not going to be covering the operational side of things, I just wanted to highlight some areas where I'm not going to deep dive as much, just to start off with. So for the business case process, that process is well underway, and I'm aware that they'll be coming to, the project team are coming to the Aspirations and Projects Committee tomorrow with an update with that, and there's going to be 2 community groups that are coming to speak to that as well. So so yeah, you can look forward to that tomorrow. From the finance perspective, the team are busy kind of tinkering away, doing everything finance related, and there's a number of workshops that will be coming up, and will continue coming to elected members throughout that process as well. So in terms of kind of the workshop dates that we're looking at for the budget side of things, we're looking at in November time, so we'll likely get back to you around then in terms of budgets. And then for the 4 remaining asset management plans, performance framework, activity management plans, and review of strategies, we're really in that kind of operational side of things at the moment. So I just wanted to assure you that work is progressing, and we'll be coming to you for those kind of workshops in relation to these key streams of work as and when necessary. So we'll kind of get into some of the other streams of work and a bit more information that we can provide to you. So for the environmental scan, we came to elected members with a workshop a couple of weeks ago to discuss the environmental scan, and we kind of highlighted some of the key trends that we're seeing in the local district. And in that discussion, we asked for direction from councillors, which essentially allowed us to press ahead with the high growth scenario. So this has kind of helped to inform some of the subsequent work that is currently underway. And we are extremely close to having the first draft of this environmental scan ready for you. So I'd say this week is when we're looking to release that. So that will be the first draft. Vision for Whanganui. So Elise has obviously highlighted the purpose for the name, as you've seen probably a couple of iterations of that prior to this discussion. So from a partnership approach perspective, we've mentioned previously that we've been engaging with local iwi and hapu to establish that kind of partnership approach throughout this process, and it's really imperative for us to do so. And we're pleased to say that we've now established a weekly steering group with representation from Ngāraru, Ngā Parangi, Tupoho and Te Ohu. And as we've mentioned previously, we've gone out to everyone to ask how they'd like to be involved, and these are iwi and hapu who would like to be involved in the discussion at the table. Others we've have other arrangements with. So yeah, really pleased to say that has started, and we're expecting kind of momentum to pick up from this point. From the community leads perspective, we had mentioned previously that we've been speaking to leads to kind of understand their current views of the current strategy as it is, and just to kind of gauge challenges and areas of focus from their perspectives to help establish the new strategy as it may be. Elise did send through a list of names to councillors a couple of weeks ago, I think it was now, so I would encourage you to read through the list that has come through, and just let us know if there's anyone that you think we should be speaking to on your radar that we haven't quite picked up yet. And yeah, we'll get those added to the list. So engagement, just to remind you, this is both from a long-term plan and a vision for Whanganui perspective, as the two are very much interlinked. And for this current stage within the process, we're focusing on that vision for Whanganui side of things, which will then help to inform the long-term plan later in the stage. You may have noticed the post on the left up on the screen there has popped up on our social media channels in the last week or so. And this is essentially the beginning part of that wider engagement. So we're essentially just testing these channels at this stage, and how we can kind of use those digital platforms to help gather information and feedback from the community. So the team are also working on how that's going to look offline as well. So that process will be mirrored offline too. So this post, as of yesterday, had gained 653 reactions and multiple comments, all very positive and engaging. So if you haven't had a look through, I'd encourage you to have a look at some of the comments coming through. And we've also launched the Vision for Whanganui webpage as well. So this essentially gives the community an understanding of the work that's currently underway and the timeline of engagement that they can expect to come. Review of policies. So the team are busy reviewing the policies that we have in place. And on the 24th of August, we'll be coming to one of the workshops to present these policies to you, to give you a better understanding of their purpose, the key aspects of each of the policies, how each of them are applied, and kind of any issues or opportunities that the teams have identified throughout their review. So that's later this month. And last but not least, we've got the final output. So for those of you who haven't seen the current long-term plan documents from the the last cycle. There's an image up there on the screen for you. So there's currently 3 different volumes as they are. So the team have really started very early at thinking about how those final outputs can look next year, and we're essentially wanting something that we're proud to distribute, right? So some of the kind of key objectives for this is to create a document that the community are able and willing to pick up to read, that incorporates our unique voice, and we're really looking to kind of shorten it and make it a lot more succinct and digestible as well. So starting this work very early means it gives us a lot more time to make those kind of well thought decisions, and with all of the other work that's happening around it. So we'll keep you updated as this starts to develop as well. So that is everything from me in terms of update, from an update perspective. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you. Questions? Rob.
Thank you. Obviously a lot of work going into this, and it's a pretty big job, and I understand that. I am concerned though that we are, so far in the conversation, we haven't heard how Three Waters is going to be handled in this 10-year plan. And I think that you need to explain to us what's the implications of a change of government in this, because it seems to me that we are doing a 10-year plan with the current, without Three Waters being taken into account.
I'm just going to step in there, and you'll think me picky, Rob, but what I just heard you say is you need to explain to us what, you know. Instead, I'd invite you to say, could you please explain to us how the effect of a change in government might affect Three Waters?
Just what Kate said.
I think David wants to talk to this one. Yeah. But reassuring you that we are, obviously, we've got Catherine on board, and we're very closely looking at what is happening, and we are certainly as aware as you are of the uncertainties, but the current direction, the current situation is that Three Waters will be out from 1 or 2 years. So we do have to take into account Three Waters in the first year or two, but beyond that, we don't have a crystal ball, so we're not able to foresee various scenarios. But I'll let David talk to it, because I'm sure he'll do it much more eloquently than me.
Through you, Madam Chair, so I'm going to avoid talking about the actual details of the reforms itself, and because that's not really relevant for the item, but in terms of how we're incorporating it into the long-term plan, at the moment we're effectively looking at a bit like a decision tree and anticipating the potential big changes. You've already highlighted one, which would be the election in October could change the government's policy position pretty substantially. We are in a good position in terms of knowing roughly what the opposition's policy on Three Waters looks like in terms of its key features, their better water done locally policy. But at this stage, in our early planning, we are effectively going to be preparing an LTP that has waters in it and also waters without it. And then as we go through the next few months and we get more clarity from the policymakers and from central government, we can start to refine our plan overall. Whatever we do, the underpinning assumptions will be documented. It's one of the requirements of the LTP. So if once it's adopted, there are substantial changes, you always have those assumptions recorded as your baseline benchmark to refer back to. At this stage, I think the most probable outcome is that somewhere circa mid-2025, Three Waters will disappear from Council's LTP, and it will be delivered by another entity, whether that's under the current Labour government's proposal or under a national government if we get one. They also are proposing a regionalised model with, say, a CCO delivering the water services for the whole of the Horizons region. So we can firm up the LTP reasonably closely at the moment, but we'll continue to refine it over the next 8 months.
Helen?
Thank you. It's a question for the CE. The the vision work forms the basis of really where we want to invest into the future, and yet it's running in parallel with our LTP, as opposed to having the vision work done first and then we can make decisions around the LTP. Can you talk to us about some of the problems that that's perhaps going to create for us in this fairly tight program?
So through you, Madam Chair, look, you are right. It's one of the less than optimal outcomes of a relatively short election cycle with only 3 years. You've come on as a new council just in September. We're now trying to build a new vision as we're already on the runway heading towards a long-term plan, which is in of itself a significant piece of work that normally consumes a lot of staff time for a period of 12 to 15 months. So one of the challenges is how do we actually get that work done to a high standard and engaging in a genuine way with our community at large, but also some of our partners like our iwi and hapu, plus some of the other agencies that operate in our town, so that we've got something that's going to be enduring in terms of a vision and an overall strategy and sense of direction for the district, whilst also crunching through a 10-year budget setting process. There is some opportunity for us to kind of adapt and take this in our stride as we go. Whilst it would be ideal to have a strategy fully finished and a vision for Whanganui nailed by the LTP deadlines, we don't want to compromise the quality of that work. So if it has to go longer and it has to straddle a couple of LTPs and we have to adapt and pivot through an annual plan in the future, then those options are available to us. Not ideal, not optimal, but I think we'll have to make some of those calls as we see this thing roll out and develop, for the benefit of making sure we get a good and enduring vision for where we want our community to grow over the next, say, 20 years. Once that's locked in, we can adapt and pivot our plans, and we'll have to continually do that over whatever the term of the vision is, because our environment, our operating environment, our context will continue to shift, even if our vision and our overall mission stays pretty constant. So yeah, hopefully that's answered your question. Not ideal, but we're going to make the best of it.
Elise, did you want to add something?
To add, we have committed to get the first draft by end of October. So that will provide the framework that we can then start to slot that into the LTP. So certainly that work is happening now and is up front as much as we can. We need to have the community outcomes prepared by November so they can slot into the long-term plan. So I wanted to give you some reassurance that that work will come ahead of the LTP, but also acting parallel.
Through you, Madam Chair, just a final comment, because Elise has done a great job of catching a gap I left there. So whilst we may not have an absolutely finalised strategy or vision by the time we're locking in the LTP, we're going to have a growing sense of where our community's priorities lie and what they want, even if we haven't got a published strategy document. So even if we haven't finished the work, as Elise has kind of alluded to here, you're still going to end up with a good LTP that should be a material improvement on where we are today, in terms of picking up the cues that are coming from that Whanganui vision for Whanganui work, and the LTP will already be starting to turn us in the direction that we want to head to, even if the strategy work hasn't completely had the ink dry on it.
I think that makes sense. In fact, I'm sure it makes sense. All right, any further questions? Thank you, and thank you for agreeing to come along to Safe Whanganui and give us an update. I think it's really important that within your time constraints and our resources, that this work is socialised and talked about at, you know, at this engagement level as much as possible. So, yeah, Robin and Elise are coming along to Safer Whanganui at our next meeting, and that will capture, you know, some of the agencies. How are we feeling about engagement with education and health?
Yeah, so we have already engaged with some representatives in those kind of buckets, I'd say. I'm not sure if you have looked at the list that's been sent through.
I did look at the list.
Yeah. In terms of, especially from an healthcare perspective, education-wise, yeah, we've got Ministry of Education, and we have reached out to multiple schools around the district as well, and it kind of comes down to their time as well, whether they're able to engage with us as well. So yeah, we're
that's the trick, isn't it? When everybody's so busy.
Yeah.
Is I'm sure there's a willingness, but just to get past the busyness hurdle.
Yeah.
All right. No further questions. Thank you, ladies. We'll put the recommendation that the committee receives the progress report on the long-term plan 2024-2034 and the Vision for Whanganui work programme. Would someone like to move that recommendation? Thank you, Glenda. Thank you, Charlotte.
Could I speak to it, please?
Sure.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for the team for the enormous amount of work that is involved in not only a long-term plan, which sets our budgets for the next 10 years, but also for the vision work, which is pretty critical to where we think we're going. Without a really strong vision, as we all know, you just don't go anywhere. And I think it's becoming more and more important that a vision does have a lot of clarity. We just came back, that was me, myself and Councillor Fallon, went to the Local Government New Zealand conference in Christchurch, which was absolutely fantastic, and we intend bringing a bit of a workshop to you to give you some of the learnings that we had, and there were some amazing slides and amazing information and presentation and debates. But one of the key ones for me, there was a presentation by the Commissioner for the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act from Wales. And in Wales, they passed a new act called the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And they appointed an independent commissioner, and her job was to ensure that any government legislation or projects was kept honest to the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And we're very much, I want to get a copy of that and the outcomes. But one of the things she talked about, for example, is there was a new roading project that was going to go through a swamp, and it got approved, went through all the normal processes and fully approved, and then she's put up her hand and say, so how does this meet their specific objectives within that Wellbeing of Future Generations Act? And she got that decision overturned. And that was an incredible, powerful vision that they had, that they put into an act and then had an independent commissioner. And I think in terms of, I got a bit excited about that because I felt that that was a whole way of looking at things that a whole country was taking on board, and without that clear vision, what are we setting up for the future? So I think there's quite a lot for us to take away from that. The other key thing I'll just say is that several of the presenters talked about the amount of funding that comes to local government, and I don't think it'll be a surprise to any of you that of the total tax take that New Zealanders pay to central and local government, the total tax take through rates and all taxes, local government gets 10%. 10%. And I think we do an amazing amount of work for 10% of the total tax take. And one of those slides also showed that in recent years, the amount of tax percentage-wise going to central government was increasing exponentially. So there's a big concern there, and we're talking about localism, and there's been a lot of talk in local government about localism. We want more money from central government to come down to us so that we can be more the determinators of our community's future, because the studies are showing that we are better at making decisions for our communities than central government. And just very finally, as an example, in Germany, 35% goes to local government, and in the United Kingdom, 25%. So we are well down in the pecking order about how much money goes to local government. So I just thought I'd pass that on, and I think it's, again, reiterating how important this bit of work that staff are doing is. Thank you.
Nice, thanks Helen. All right, we've got a recommendation. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. Thank you. That brings us to the end of our meeting, but I'd ask that you just hang around for a couple of minutes after we've closed, because David wanted to have a chat with us. I will read a closing karakia. I oha ki runga ki a Whanganui. I oha ki raro ki a Papatuanuku. Wakatairanga, te kupu, te kōrero, te mahi. Ki te pō o te whare, he taonga he mahi a muri, ka puta ki te wai ao, ki te ao marama. Humie, huie, taikie. We greet the things above, we greet the things below, in all its entirety. Let's suspend the words, the discussion, the work covered to the pillar of the house as a treasure point of importance to be revisited at a later time, so that we may enter into enlightenment, let it be bound and fixed, yes, fixed and agreed by all. Amen. Thank you, folks.